The morning the divorce was final, Brett kept the house on Linden Court, both cars, and the dog, then slid a single folded deed and a check for $41 across the mediation table to Della, like a man tipping a waitress he'd never have to see again. He thought he was handing her a joke. He was handing her the one piece of Loon Lake that nobody alive could ever take back. It would take her 21 days, a swollen hinge, and her grandfather's worn pocket knife to understand what she was really holding. By then, Brett's whole new life would already be leaning its full weight on a cabin he'd laughed off as firewood. "It's a $4,000 pile of firewood with a tax lien," Brett said, tapping the deed once with 2 fingers. "Call it even." Even. 6 years of marriage, and the man wanted to call it even with $41, and a building his own lawyer had written down as worth $1 on the settlement sheet. $1. $1 against the whole lake, and not one person in that lemon-polished little office thought twice about the figure. "Sign by the tab," Brett said, already checking his phone. "Brooke's got us at 2 o'clock. From the bench by the door, Brooke laughed, soft behind one manicured hand. "Is that the lake place?" she asked, leaning to see the deed. "The one your mum said had the outhouse? You know the type. The kind of laugh that has already been told what's funny, and is just waiting for the cue." Della didn't give her one. She'd rebuilt her first outboard at 14, kneeling on her grandfather's dock with grease to her elbows, and she could still tell a dead motor from a flooded one by smell alone. Hands like that don't rattle in a quiet room. They wait. So she sat very still, and she read the legal description on the deed twice while the lawyer cleared his throat. And something in her went cold and certain, in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone at that table. Here was the arithmetic of a marriage. He took the house on Linden Court, the one she'd painted every room of. He took the truck and the little grey Corolla she'd bought herself. He even took Cooper, the brown shepherd mix she'd raised from 8 weeks, because Brett had figured out by then that keeping the dog would hurt the most for the least money. Della got a deed and a check for $41, the last sad balance of a joint account split down the middle after fees, a number so precise it felt designed to insult. She signed the final page. She'd been Della Mercer for 6 years. The decree restored her maiden name, so she signed it Della Hartwell, and her hand did not shake. Her own lawyer, the cheap one, the only one she could afford, had told her twice to take the cabin and be done. He needn't have worried. Some people fight for the house. Della had only ever wanted the lake. She drove north that same afternoon, a rented sedan and 1 suitcase, 4 hours up the spine of the state to where the interstate gave out. An old Highway 51 took over the work of carrying people into the trees. The radio lost its city stations one by one. Pine closed in on both shoulders. Somewhere past the 3rd bait shop, the land remembered her. Maple Landing in April was a town holding its breath. Half the cottages were still shuttered for the season, plywood over the windows like closed eyes. Out on Loon Lake, the ice hadn't fully quit, grey and rotten along the shallows, the kind that doesn't let go up here until the calendar's almost embarrassed about it. County Road W ran out to the water and turned to gravel, and the gravel ran out to a point the old men still called Hartwell's Stretch, though there were no Hartwells left on it but her. She stopped for gas at the station that doubled as the register of deeds, 1 window for tax stamps and 1 for cigarettes. The man behind the counter took her 20 and looked at her a beat too long. "You'd be Hollis's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. When she said the old cabin was hers now, he made a small sound through his teeth. Hartwell's old place. Huh. Didn't figure anybody'd ever take that on. Leon's bigger than the roof. He said it kindly. That was the thing about being given something worthless. Everyone agreed gently to your face. She left the rental at the head of the drive and walked the last 100 yards on foot. Because the ruts would have eaten the rental's oil pan, the suitcase wheels caught every stone and quit being wheels. Her ponytail snapped sideways in the wind off the water. She wore the mustard rain jacket because up here April still bit, and she walked with her back to the road, toward a warped door at the end of a gravel drive, the way you walk towards something you have decided to love before you've seen how bad it's gotten. It had gotten bad. The porch sagged at one corner. Moss had taken the north side of the roof. A woodpile the size of a small car leaned against the east wall, split and stacked and never burned, and she understood the cruel little joke of the settlement all over again. Firewood. They'd called it firewood, and there was the literal pile, waiting as if the lawyers had toured the place and laughed. She set the suitcase down on the porch boards. When you have nothing left, the smallest welcome can undo you. And the cabin gave her one anyway. The lake spread out past the dock, slate and silver, exactly the colour it had been the summer she was 6. She knocked twice before she went in. 2 soft knuckle taps on a door with no one behind it. Hollis had always done that, announced himself to an empty house like the house might mind being startled, and nobody had ever taught her to do it. It just lived in her hands. The door wouldn't swing. The bottom hinge had swollen and rusted in place, the way iron does when the cold and the damp keep at it for a year, with no one to argue. So Della did what the old man would have done. She thumbed open the worn pocket knife she still carried in her inside jacket pocket, his pocket knife, bone-handled and sharpened down thin, and she scraped the rust off the pin and worked a little oil into the joint from the dusty can on the sill until the door swung clean and quiet. She stood there a second with her hand on the wood, then she went in. Hollis had been gone a year. The cabin still kept him. It smelled of wood smoke and linseed oil, and the cherry pipe tobacco he was never supposed to keep, and always did. His canvas coat still hung on the iron hook by the door. A coffee can of sorted nails sat on the workbench, organised by size, because the man had organised everything but his feelings. Della didn't cry exactly. She just stood in the cold front room and let the smell take her. Somewhere a year of paperwork had tried to make her forget. Before dark she found the switch and left the porch light on. One yellow bulb burning against all that water and pine. For no one, because there was no one for half a mile to see it. She left it on anyway. That was the whole point of a porch light. It said someone was home before anyone arrived to need the saying. She might have stayed inside the rest of that evening if the dog 2 coves over hadn't started up, and she'd gone to the window and seen the man at her fence, out past the property line, where Hartwell's stretch ran into the deep water that never froze right. A man in a clean canvas jacket stood at her fence with a tripod and a yellow surveyor's transit, sighting down her shoreline like he was measuring it for a suit. She went out. "This is private property," she called across the cold grass. He didn't hurry. He folded the tripod legs in, unbothered, a man who'd been told he had every right to be there. "Just confirming some lines for the county, ma'am," he said. The kind of sentence that means nothing, and everything at once. "Won't be a minute? Whose county work needs my shoreline at supper time?" He only smiled. The patient smile of a man on a clock that wasn't hers, and carried his gear to a white pickup with a magnetic sign on the door she couldn't quite read in the failing light. Then he was gravel dust and taillights, gone back toward 51. Della stood at the fence a long while after. The deep water lapped black at the foot of the point, the one stretch of Loon Lake that stayed open when everything else iced over, and she could not for the life of her think why anyone would drive 4 hours to measure a worthless lot at the end of a worthless road. You know the type. The man who says the county when he means a checkbook. She didn't have the words for it yet. She only had the cold feeling, the same one from the mediation table, that someone knew something about this place that she didn't. She went back inside and built a fire, because the night had teeth. The hearth took up most of the front wall. Fieldstone Hollis had laid by hand, a stone at a time, and the mantel above it was a single slab of oak he'd milled himself from a tree off the property. She ran her palm along the underside of it, out of old habit, and her fingers found them. The rings. A row of small carved circles cut into the wood at a child's height, worn smooth and shallow by 40 years of thumbs, including her own. "Count the rings, Della girl." He'd said it the summer she was 6, crouched at the hearth with her, tapping that oak with one blunt finger. "I didn't leave you a cabin. I left you the one piece of this lake nobody can take." She thought it was a riddle with no answer, the kind grandfathers invented to keep a child quiet. She counted them 100 times, and never once found the joke at the end of it. She counted them now. 7 rings. She didn't know what 7 was supposed to mean, but kneeling there with the firelight on the stone, she noticed the thing she'd somehow walked past her whole childhood. Beside the firebox set into the fieldstone was a square panel of painted board that didn't belong, that had never belonged, sealed under so many coats of cream paint over so many years that it had gone smooth and blind as bone. She set the back of the pocket knife against it, tapped. The sound came back hollow. Della worked the thin blade along the edge, and somewhere under all that paint it caught a seam, a hairline crack the cream had spent decades trying to swallow. She pried, gentle, then less gentle. The old paint cracked along the joint with a sound like ice giving. The panel shifted a quarter-inch in its frame, and out of the dark behind it came a breath of cold, dry air that had been waiting in that wall a very long time to be let out. The panel came away in her hands like a scab off a healed thing, all at once and then completely, and Della sat back on her heels with it across her knees and looked into the dark square it left behind in the fieldstone. The cavity wasn't deep, a foot maybe, hollowed into the masonry beside the firebox, where the heat would have kept it dry through every winter the lake ever threw at it. Cool air came out of it, the held breath of a sealed place, and under the smell of old paint and stone there was something else. Paper and tin and the faint cherry ghost of his tobacco. As if the man had reached in there last week instead of a lifetime of weeks ago. She set the pocket knife down on the hearth. She reached in with both hands. The first thing she touched was a tin. A flat candy tin, the kind that used to hold butterscotch. The lid gone to freckled rust at the corners, but the seam still tight. She drew it out into the firelight and pried it with her thumbnail, and the lid gave with a small complaint. And inside, folded in quarters, and soft as cloth from age, were her own drawings. She knew them before she had them open. A child's lake, drawn in the fat strokes of a kid who pressed too hard. A blue scribble of water, a brown box of a cabin, a stick man with a hat, and a stick girl, half his size, on a dock that ran off the edge of the page. Across the top, in the careful oversized letters of someone just learning them, she had written Della and Grandpa, and gotten the second L backward. She was 6 in that drawing. She was 26 on the hearth, and for a moment the two of them looked at each other across the firelight, and neither one of them said a word. Under the drawings, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was a key. Brass, heavy, longer than a house key, and older, the kind that turned a real lock with real weight behind it. It had a number stamped into the bow, worn nearly smooth, and a tag of cardstock tied to it with kitchen string. She turned the tag to the fire. The handwriting stopped her heart. She would have known it on the far side of the world. The blunt capitals, the way he crossed his sevens like a European, though he'd never left the state. The slight downhill slope of a man writing fast because the thought outran the pencil. Hollis's hand. And what it said, in that hand, was this. For Della. When you are ready, and not before. Count the rings, girl. I told you I left you something nobody could take. She read it 4 times. She read it until the letters stopped being letters and went back to being him. His voice, the cigarette rasp of it. Count the rings. Della girl. The way he'd said it crouched right here on this same stone when her feet didn't reach the floor. She did not cry exactly. That isn't the right word for what happens when a person who has spent a year being divided, appraised and handed $41 finds her own name written in the hand of the one man who never once made her feel like a line item. She put her back against the warm fieldstone and she held the tag in both hands and she let the fire blur. And outside the window, the deep water of Hartwell's Stretch lapped at the dock in the dark, patient as it had ever been. She slept that night in his canvas coat in front of the fire, the key on its string around her neck, and she did not look for what it opened. When you are ready, and not before. She had learned a long time ago that the man did not waste words. If he said not before, then there was a before to get to, the first, and she would get to it, his way. In the morning she drove into Maple Landing for coffee and a hinge pin, and that was how she met Earl Brody, though met is the wrong word for a man who looked up from the counter of the hardware on County Road W, saw her face, and set his cup down very carefully. You'd be Della, he said, Hollis's girl. You've got his straight back. He was 80 if he was a day, hands like rootwood, a man who'd clearly built things his whole life and missed it, now that he didn't. Earl Brody. I framed that cabin with your grandfather. Summer of 71, hauled every stick of that roof up off the ice myself back when I had a back. She liked him at once, the way you like anyone who knew a person you've lost and isn't afraid to say their name. She told him about the hinge, and then, because the coffee was good and the morning was slow and the old man's eyes were kind, she told him about the panel, the tin, the key. She didn't mean to. It came out of her the way a thing comes out when you've been carrying it alone for a night that felt like a year. Earl Brody went quiet. Then he said, describe the box for me. The Heidi in the stone. Was it square or was it stepped at the back? Stepped, she said. There's a little shelf at the back, lower than the front. The old man nodded slowly, like a doctor hearing a heartbeat he'd been hoping for. That's Hollis. That's his hand exact. He built false backs into everything, that man. Drove me half crazy on the job, always wanting a second compartment behind the first. He looked at her a long moment. He'd tell you to count the rings. The cup stopped halfway to her mouth. How do you know that? Because he said it to me too once, near the end, and I didn't think a thing of it. Figured he was talking trees. Earl Brody wiped the counter that didn't need wiping. Hollis Hartwell never said a thing he didn't mean twice. You go count your rings, girl. Whatever he hid it for you, and he hid it good, and he meant for you to be the one to find it. Not them lawyers. You. She drove back out County Road W, faster than the gravel liked. She knew where the rings were. She'd run her thumb across them 1,000 times as a child, without ever once asking why a man would carve 7 little circles into the underside of an oak mantle at exactly the height of a kneeling girl. 7 rings. She'd thought it was decoration. She'd thought it was nothing. She knelt at the hearth and she counted them again, slow, touching each one, and this time she did what she had never thought to do in 20 years of counting. She pressed them, one by one, and the 7th ring, the last one, the one farthest from the fire, gave under her thumb with a soft wooden click, and somewhere below the floorboards something let go. A section of the floor, a single wide plank she'd walked across 100 times, lifted half an inch at one end. She got her fingers under it. It came up clean, on a hidden iron pin, a hatch so well fitted that the seam had hidden in the grain her whole life. And in the dry, dark space beneath the cabin floor, resting on 2 cleats her grandfather had set there before she could walk, was a steel tube, capped at both ends. A surveyor's tube, the kind that carries rolled documents through 50 years of damp without letting a drop reach the paper inside. Her hands knew what to do before her head caught up. The brass key on its string fit the lock through the cap. It turned with the weight of something built to last. The cap came off in her palm. She tipped the tube and a roll of paper slid out into her hands, and wrapped around the outside of it, held with a rubber band gone to powder, was a long flat strip of stiff certificates she didn't recognise, printed and numbered and edged in green, each one with a row of little coupons along the bottom, like tickets waiting to be torn. She set those aside. It was the rolled paper that mattered. She unrolled it on the floor in the window light, and weighted the corners with 2 pieces of firewood. And she read it, and the cold, certain feeling from the mediation table came back and stood up the whole length of her spine. It was a deed, a real one, with the heavy printing and the county seal, and the recorder's stamp pressed into the corner in faded purple ink. A trust deed, and it did not describe a $4,000 pile of firewood. It described the shoreline, all of it. The deep water frontage at the end of Hartwell Stretch, the one stretch of Loon Lake that never iced over, the only frontage on the whole lake where a man could put a real dock and a real marina and float a boat in March. And it described the lots that flanked it, the empty wooded parcels she'd always assumed belonged to the county or to nobody. The lots a stranger with a yellow transit had been sighting down at supper time on her very first night. Lot after lot. 40 years of them, bought one at a time, quiet as snow, by a man everyone in Maple Landing had written off as a harmless old millwright who tinkered in a falling-down cabin. And the trust had a name on it, a beneficiary, typed neat on the dotted line by some lawyer in a town 4 hours south in a year she could do the math on without trying. Della Hartwell. Not Mercer. Hartwell. Recorded in 1999, the deed said, with the stamp to prove it. She had been 3 years old in 1999. She would not meet Brett Mercer for another 19 years. She would not stand at a mediation table and sign away a marriage for another 27. In the margin, in pencil, in the blunt downhill hand she'd have known anywhere, her grandfather had written it one more time. The line he'd been saying to her since before she could walk. The line she'd carried for 20 years thinking it was a riddle with no answer. I didn't leave you a cabin, Della girl. I left you the one piece of this lake nobody can take. Count the rings. She sat on the floor of the cold cabin for a long time, with the deed across her knees and the strip of green certificates beside her, and the lake going slate and silver outside the window. And she understood, finally and completely, what she was holding. Not firewood, not a $4,000 lot with a lien bigger than the roof. She was holding the last piece of frontage anyone would ever assemble on Loon Lake, put together stone by stone, and lot by lot, over 40 silent years by a man who had decided, before she could even say his name, that no one would ever get to divide her down the middle the way they divided everything else. She thought about the surveyor at her fence, the clean canvas jacket, the county work that needed her shoreline at supper time. She thought about the white pickup with the magnetic sign she couldn't read, and she had a cold idea now whose checkbook that man had been working for, and why a worthless lot at the end of a worthless road had been handed to her like a tip by a man in a hurry to get to a 2 o'clock. She rolled the deed back up, gentle as a sleeping thing, but she did not put it back under the floor. The next morning she was waiting on the step of the Register of Deeds when the one window opened, the deed tube under her arm, the mustard jacket zipped to the chin, against an April that still hadn't decided to be spring. The clerk was a tired woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she took one look at the certified copy. Della slid across the counter and went still, in the particular way people go still when a small ordinary morning turns into something they'll be telling people about for years. "Where did you get this?" the clerk said. "My grandfather's cabin. Out on Hartwell's stretch." Della kept her voice level, the way you keep your hands level over a flooded motor you're trying not to spook. "I'd like you to pull the original. I want to know it's real, and I want to know the date it was recorded, and I want a certified copy I can put in someone's hand and have it stand up." The clerk looked at her over the glasses. Then she got up without a word and went into the back, into the rows of bound books that held everything Maple Landing had ever bought or sold or left to anybody. And Della stood at the one window with the lake at her back and waited, still and certain, the way her grandfather had taught her hands to wait long before he ever told her why. The clerk was gone long enough for the radiator to tick twice, and the wall clock to count out a slow full minute, and a single car to pass on the wet April street outside, with its tyres hissing on the asphalt. When she came back, she was not carrying a folder or a printout. She was carrying a book, a bound ledger the size of a paving stone. Green cloth gone soft and pale at the corners, and she set it on the counter with both hands the way a person sets down a thing that has more weight than its weight. She turned it so it faced Della, and she laid one finger flat against a line of type halfway down the page. "There it is," she said, and her voice had dropped to the register people use in church. "Recorded the 9th of March, 1999. 8:40 in the morning. Volume 418, page 213. Trust deed. Hollis R. Hartwell. Grantor. To the Della Hartwell Trust. Beneficiary." She looked up over the beaded chain of her glasses. "Now I want you to understand what you're looking at. That is not a copy. That is the book itself, the original record, the one we'd carry out of a burning courthouse, before we carried out the coffee pot, and it has been sitting in my back room, untouched, since before you lost your milk teeth." Della put her finger beside the clerk's on the cold page. The ink had gone a little brown with the years, but the letters held. Her own name in a county ledger, set down by a stranger's typewriter the year she turned 3. "How do I know it's the same ground?" Della said. "The cabin's deed, the firewood lot, that's a different parcel." "How do I know this is the shoreline?" The clerk almost smiled. "Because your grandfather was a careful man, and careful men write a legal description that leaves no daylight." She slid her finger down the page and read it out. The old surveyor's language. Government Lot 4. The meander line of Loon Lake. The deep water frontage running from the section corner along the water's edge to the point locally known. And here the typewriter had typed the words themselves, as Hartwell's stretch. "There's your point," the clerk said. He didn't trust a map to hold it. He put the name the whole town uses right into the legal description, so no lawyer 400 miles south could ever pretend he didn't know which water he meant. That's not a man who hid something and forgot it. That's a man who built a wall around a thing and signed his name to every brick. Della stood with her back to the window and the lake behind her, and she felt the cold certainty climb her spine and stand all the way up, the same feeling she'd had on her knees on the hearth with the deed across her lap, except now it had a date stamped on it in faded purple and a county woman's finger holding it down. "There's more of him in here," Della said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the lots on the rolled deed, the flanking parcels, the wooded ground she'd grown up believing belonged to the county, or to no one. The clerk studied her a moment. Then she went back into the stacks and came out with a second book, thinner, a tracked index, the running tally of who had bought what along that shore since the courthouse first opened a drawer for it. She licked her thumb and turned to the H's, and turned the book around again, and she ran her nail down a column, and Della watched her own name's other half march down the page, in entry after entry after entry. Hartwell, Hollis R.R., grantee. 1981, 1986, 2 lots in 1990, another in 94, 2 more across the back half of the decade, a strip of marsh frontage in 2003. The last one as recent as the spring before he died. An old man driving himself to this very window to record a deed with a hand that by then must have shaken. 40 years, the clerk said softly. I joined this office in '88, and I stamped some of these myself, and I never once put it together. He'd come in maybe every other year, quiet, in that canvas coat, and he'd record one little lot and pay his fee in cash, and ask after my mother and drive home. We all thought he was a tinkerer. We thought he bought scrap ground because it was cheap, and he liked to own a piece of the water. She closed the index gently. He wasn't buying scrap. He was buying the whole far shore 1 lot at a time, so slow that nobody, not one soul in Maple Landing, ever saw the shape of it come together. He bought the lake out from under everybody, honey, and he did it so polite that we held the door for him while he did. Della asked the next question, because she already half knew the answer, and the not knowing the whole of it had been sitting in her chest since her first night, since the man in the clean canvas jacket sighting his yellow transit down her fence line, while the supper light went out of the sky. Somebody's been surveying out there, she said. At my fence. The first night I came. He told me it was county work. The clerk's face did a thing then. A small closing. The look of a person who has been asked the one question she was hoping wouldn't get asked in front of her. She didn't answer with words. She went to a flat, wide cabinet against the wall, the kind that holds maps lying down, and she slid out a long drawer and lifted from it a fresh sheet, a plat, the paper still bright and uncreased the way only a recent filing is, and she carried it to the counter and unrolled it under the fluorescent light and weighted its corners with a stapler and a roll of tape and her own 2 hands. It was a resort, printed and surveyed and rendered in an architect's hopeful grey. A marina with 60 slips drawn in, 3 buildings of condominiums stepped down to the water, a clubhouse, a launch, a parking field, a swimming basin dredged out of the shallows. Across the top in a confident modern typeface it said, Loon Lake Landing, a planned resort community. And below that, smaller Sutter Development Group, Garrett Sutter, managing member, and a filing date 6 weeks old. And in the middle of all that grey hopefulness, right at the tip of the point where the deep water never iced, there was a single lot left unshaded, a white hole in the heart of the plan. Someone had drawn a dashed line around it and lettered a note inside in a drafting hand. Della leaned down and read the note. It said, parcel to be acquired prior to closing. See financing contingency. It was her lot, the firewood lot. The $4,000 pile of nothing, with the tax lien that Brett's lawyer had valued at $1 and slid across a table like a coin onto a diner counter. The whole thing's drawn around your point, the clerk said. Every dock and every condo on this sheet is cited off the assumption they get that 1 lot, because it's the only deep water on the lake. You can't float a boat anywhere else before May. Without your point, this whole plat is 60 slips of dry mud. She looked at Della steady. And there's one more thing in the book you ought to see, because it's public, and it's yours to see same as anybody's. She pulled a 3rd record, a mortgage index, and she found the line without much looking, like she'd already looked once today on her own, and she turned it for Della to read, and Della read it, and the floor of the morning tilted very slightly under her boots. A mortgage, recorded 11 weeks back, against the house on Linden Court. The house Della had stood up and walked away from, with a folded deed and a cheque for $41. Brett had borrowed against it. Borrowed deep. The figure typed out long and full of zeros, and the lender's name on the line was Sutter Development Group. He had mortgaged the house he won to buy his way into the resort that could not be built without the lot he had thrown away. He had bet the roof over his new life on a piece of ground he was so sure was worthless that he'd handed it to his ex-wife as a joke and laughed about it with his fiancée at the mediation table. Della straightened up. She did not say anything for a while. The clerk let her not say it. I'd like 3 certified copies, Della said finally, of the trust deed, the recording, March of '99. And keep the rest where it is. You'll have them in 10 minutes, the clerk said. And then, lower. I knew your grandfather 40 years and I never told him so, but I'll tell you, he was the most stubborn, decent, sly old man this town ever grew, And if you wrapped a wall around your name, child, you stand inside it. You let them come to the wall. Della drove the County Road W back out toward the lake, with the 3 blue-backed certified copies flat on the seat beside her, and she did not go home. She turned in at the hardware on the corner where the road met old Highway 51, and Earl Brody looked up from his counter and read her face the way he'd read it the first morning, and he set his cup down again, careful, the same as before. She told him all of it, the book, the date, the 40 years of lots, the plat with the white hole at her point, the mortgage on Linden Court with Sutter's name on the line. Earl Brody listened with his rootwood hands flat on the counter, and his head bowed a little. And when she got to the part about the survey deed, recorded in '99, he made a low sound in his chest that might have been a laugh, and might have been something closer to grief. "Course he did," Earl said. "Course he did it that year." He looked up. You know what was happening to him in '99? His Ruth was dying. Took her that autumn. And I'll bet you every nail in this store that he sat by that woman's bed and thought about who'd be left, and thought about a baby granddaughter 3 years old, and decided right then, while the worst thing in his life was happening to him, that no man was ever going to be able to cut you in half the way the world was cutting him. He shook his head slow. He didn't tell a living soul. He just drove to the courthouse and did it, and came home and went back to her bedside. That's Hollis. That's the whole man, right there in a date. Della had to look out the window at the grey lake for a moment before she could speak. "His lawyer's going to call," she said. "Brett's. They need the lot to close. The contingency's right there on the plat. They can't build a thing without it." Earl nodded. "And they think you've got firewood. They think you'll take a few $1,000s to make a nuisance go away. And they'll fold your point into their resort and you'll never know what you signed off." He came around the end of the counter, an old man moving careful on old knees. "When do they come?" "They don't come," Della said. "I go to them. Same table. They've already got the mediation room booked for Thursday to clean up the loose ends of the settlement." That's what the letter said. Tidy up the personal property and the last of the paperwork. She allowed herself something that was not quite a smile. "Brett's lawyer wants me to sign a quick claim on the cabin lot. He's offering $3,200 to take the worthless thing off my hands." "Out of kindness," the letter said. "So the firewood doesn't become my problem." Earl Brody looked at her for a long moment, and then the old boat builder laughed. Really laughed. A dry creaking sound that came up out of 50 years of knowing exactly what Hollis Hartwell's joinery was capable of holding. $3,200, he said, for the keystone of a man's whole mortgaged future, and he doesn't even know what he's begging for. He wiped his eye with the back of one hand. "You want company Thursday? I framed that cabin with the man. I know his hand on sight, and I'll say so to any lawyer in that room. Under oath, twice." "I'd like that, Earl," Della said. "I'd like that a lot." She drove home in the last of the light with the certified copies on the seat, and the steel survey tube standing in the footwell where she could reach it. And when she came up the gravel of Hartwell's stretch, the cabin sat there warped and patient, with its one window dark, and she let herself in. And out of a habit older than memory, she knocked twice on the open door before she stepped through it. She built the fire up. She sat on the hearth where the panel had been, and she ran her thumb over the 7 rings carved in the underside of the mantel. Slow, one at a time, the way she had counted them as a child who couldn't reach the floor. Then she went out onto the porch, in the cold, and she reached up, and she turned on the light, the bare bulb over the warped door, and she left it burning out over the black water, the way her grandfather had left it burning every night of his life, so anyone coming home across the dark of Loon Lake would know which point was theirs. Thursday was 3 days off. She would be ready and not before. Thursday came in grey and windless, the lake lying flat as poured pewter clear across to the far shore. No birds up yet, the cold still holding the water the way it had held it since November. Della was awake before the light found the window. Her hands did the old things without asking her first. She knocked twice on the frame of the bedroom door, though there was no living soul in the cabin to knock for, and never had been since the morning she carried her suitcase up the gravel. She took the worn pocket knife off the mantel and laid a single drop of oil into the throat of the front hinge, so the swollen door swung open without a sound, the way the old man had kept every hinge on the place, oiled his whole life so no door would ever give a man away coming home in the dark. She reached up and shut the porch light off in the first grey of dawn, and stood under the cold bulb a moment with her breath smoking. Then she dressed the mustard jacket and the dark jeans and the boots, pulled her hair back low and tight, slid the 3 certified copies into a flat envelope, and the envelope into her canvas bag, and she left the steel tube standing in the corner because the tube had already said everything it was built to say, and what it carried was written now into a county book no lawyer alive could pry shut. Earl Brody was waiting on the step of the hardware when she pulled in off County Road W, buttoned to the throat in a clean shirt and a sport coat that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs and looked like it had last drawn air at a funeral. He climbed into the truck without a word, set his cap on his knee, folded those rootwood hands over it, and rode beside her down old Highway 51 toward the county seat, watching the wet fields go by. "You don't have to say a thing in there," he told her once, halfway. "But if any man in that room opens his mouth about whether Hollis Hartwell built what he built, you let me stand up. I know it, Earl. I framed that hearth wall with him the summer of '71, he said, to the windshield, to the road, to the dead man maybe. I know his hand on a board same as I know my own. Let them ask. The mediation room was the same one, the same long table with the false wood top, the same water pitcher sweating on a tray, the same window with the blinds half down on a parking lot. Brett was already in it when she came through the door, in a jacket she didn't recognise, leaning back easy with one ankle hooked on his knee, and the fiancée beside him in a camel coat with her phone face down and a small private smile already arranged on her mouth. The same smile she'd worn the morning she laughed at a folded deed crossing this very wood. Brett's lawyer sat at the head with his folders squared, and there was a fourth chair filled that had stood empty the last time, a trim man near 50 in an open collar and an expensive grey quarter zip, a leather folio in front of him, who half rose and put out a hand and said, "Garrett Sutter. I don't believe we've met." Della did not take the hand. She set her canvas bag on the table, sat down across from all of them, with Earl easing into the chair at her shoulder, folded her hands, and waited. The way she had been taught to wait without anyone ever sitting her down to teach it. Brett's lawyer cleared his throat and slid a single stapled document across the wood, turning it to face her, and set a pen on top of it square as a ruler. "We'll keep this short, Della. We know it's a drive for you," he said, warm as a man can make a voice go. "Just a quick claim. The cabin parcel out on the point. The firewood lot. There's the matter of the back taxes. The lien, which frankly is a liability you don't want chasing you, and Mr. Mercer would like to take that worry off your plate entirely. We're offering $3,200 paid today for you to sign the lot over and be free of it. It's more than the ground's worth, honestly. It's a kindness." He smiled. "Firewood with a tax bill. Sign there at the flag and you can drive home lighter." Brett looked at her then, and there was no malice in it even, which was the worst of it. Only the easy boredom of a man clearing the last small dish off a table he'd already eaten everything on. "Take the money, Dell," he said. "Buy yourself something nice. No hard feelings." The fiancé's smile widened a hair. Della reached into the canvas bag. She did not pick up the pen. She drew out the flat envelope, and from it she slid one page. Blue-backed, the county's raised seal pressed into the corner, and the recorder's purple stamp bled faint across the date. And she laid it on the wood and turned it so it faced the lawyer. And she set 2 fingers flat on it the way the woman at the one window office had, and she pushed it the width of the table towards him. "Before anybody signs anything," she said, "I'd like you to read that out loud. The whole top of it, where it says who, and where, and when." The lawyer's smile held a second longer out of habit. Then he picked the page up and read, and somewhere in the second line the smile came off his face, like a decal lifted slow off glass. He read it again silently, his eyes going back to the top, and when he spoke his voice had lost all its warmth and gone careful and flat. A man reading a thing he very much wished he'd read 3 months ago. "Trust deed," he said, "recorded the 9th of March, 1999. Hollis R. Hartwell, grantor, to the Della Hartwell Trust." He stopped. He looked up at her, then sideways at Brett, then down again. 1999, Della said. "I was 3 years old. I married Brett at 22. She let that sit in the room. The deep water shoreline went into a trust in my name a long time before there was any marriage to settle. It was never ours together. It was never his to keep or to give away or to fold into anybody's deal. It was mine before I could spell my own name, and it's mine this morning." She slid a second certified copy across to sit beside the first. "That's the recording. Volume 418, Page 213. Call the register from that phone, and a clerk will read you the same words off the same book. That's, The lawyer set the page down very gently, as if it had gone hot in his hand. Brett. This parcel was listed in the marital schedule. You represented it as marital property. It was valued and conveyed in the settlement as part of the estate. He took a slow breath. It was never in the estate. The decree couldn't convey it, because it was never anyone's to convey but hers. As far as this lot goes, the settlement is talking about something that doesn't belong to the marriage at all. Brett had stopped leaning back. What does that mean? He said, and the easy boredom was gone out of him now, replaced by the first cold edge of a man who has heard a word he doesn't like the shape of. What does it mean? It's hers. It was always going to be hers, that's the whole reason we... And he caught himself a half-second too late, because the room had already heard the front of the sentence build itself. That is why we gave it to her, and Garrett Sutter heard it building too. Sutter had gone motionless in the expensive quarter zip. He was not looking at Brett. He was looking at the two blue-backed pages on the table, and then at Della. And a man who had spent 30 years reading deeds across tables was running the math behind his eyes and not getting the number he needed. Because there was a plat on file 6 weeks old with his name across the top of it, and every dock and condominium and dredged swimming basin on that hopeful grey sheet had been drawn off one assumption, written in a drafting hand inside a little dashed box at the tip of the point, the assumption that the last deep water on Loon Lake could be bought before closing, and the woman who owned that water was sitting across from him in a mustard rain jacket with her hands folded, having just declined to shake his hand. He chose to his credit not to pretend. He turned in his chair to face her square and let the warmth come into his voice the way a man does when the whole game has shifted under him in 10 seconds, and he is good enough at the game to shift with it. Miss Hartwell, Della, I think we've all been working off some bad information, and I'd like to start clean. I won't insult you with $3,200. You own the only deep water frontage on this lake, and I want to buy it from you, fairly, at market, today in principle. He opened the leather folio, uncapped a heavy pen, wrote a figure on a clean sheet, and turned it to face her. And it was not $3,000, and it was not 30,000. It was a number with one comma in it, and then another comma, a number bigger than the house on Linden Court, and the 2 cars and the whole shared life they had spent the spring dividing down the middle. He set the pen on top of it, the way the lawyer had set his. The old ritual, the offering of the instrument. That's a starting number. It only goes up. You'd never think about a tax lien or a woodpile again. And here is the turn that nobody at that table had drawn into their plat, or their schedule, or their easy afternoon. Della looked at the number a moment, the way you'd look at weather coming over the far shore, and then she pushed the sheet gently back across the wood until it sat in front of Garrett Sutter again, untouched, the pen still lying on it. The lien's already paid, she said. I cleared it 3 weeks ago, so that part of the kindness is spent. She gathered her 2 pages, squared them, slid them back into the envelope. And the shore isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. It was put in my name by a man who spent 40 years buying that whole .1 cheap lot at a time, so nobody could ever stand a marina on it. I'm not going to be the one who finally sells him out at a table 6 weeks after you drew your docks on his water. She stood. You can keep your number. Sutter held her eyes a moment longer, then closed the folio, capped the pen, and turned his head toward Brett Mercer, and the friendliness left his face all at once. Then there's no parcel, he said to Brett. Flat, businesslike, a man already 3 deals down the road from this one. The frontage was the contingency. The whole thing was built on controlling that point. Without it, there's no marina, no resort, nothing to put up. The financing doesn't close. He stood and buttoned his jacket. My people will send the formal notice, but you should hear it from me. We're out. Brett's face did the thing then that Della had driven 140 miles of wet county road to not have to enjoy, and found sitting there that she did not enjoy it, which surprised her a little, because she could see him running the same numbers Sutter had run, except his came out at the bottom of a hole. He had borrowed against the house on Linden Court, borrowed deep, borrowed it all the way up to the rafters, to buy his way into Garrett Sutter's resort. He had mortgaged the roof he won in this very room to get into a deal that could only ever pay out if he controlled the last deep water on the lake. And he had been so dead certain that deep water was a pile of firewood that he'd slid it across this table to his ex-wife like a tip, with the dog and the cars and the house all stacked safe on his side, and laughed about it with the woman in the camel coat. The deal was gone now. The loan was not. The house he'd kept was leveraged against a lake he would never own a single foot of. The fiancée wasn't smiling anymore. She had picked her phone up off the table and put it back down without looking at it, and she was watching Brett the way you watch a man whose math you have just seen come apart in front of you. And whatever the morning's private smile had been about, it was about something that no longer existed. "Della," Brett said, and his voice had dropped to a register she hadn't heard from him in years, low and reaching. "Del, listen, we can still... There's got to be a way everybody comes out of this hole. If you just... There was a lawyer here a few minutes ago who valued my grandfather's point at $1, Della said, picking up her bag. $1, against the whole lake. You should have read the deed, Brett. It had my name on it the entire time. It always did." She looked once at the lawyer, who would not meet her eyes, and last and longest at Earl Brody, who had not had to say a single word about whose hands built what, and who now rose beside her, slow on his old knees, and settled his cap on his head. "Ma'am," Earl said to the fiancée, with a courtesy so complete it had an edge you could shave with. And then he held the door, and the two of them walked out of that room into the grey morning, and left the three of them sitting around the falsewood table with a quick claim. Nobody would be signing, a number nobody would be cashing, and a resort that would never sink one piling in the water. They drove home the way they'd come, north up old Highway 51 and west onto County Road W, and the cloud broke somewhere past the bait shop, and a low gold light came out over the wet fields and ran on ahead of the truck toward the lake. Earl didn't say much. Once he said he really never read it, and shook his head, and that was most of it. 2 weeks after, a man Della had never wronged in her life backed his boat trailer down a fresh-cut gravel ramp at the tip of the point. A retired schoolteacher from over in Maple Landing who had fished that water as a boy, back when Hollis still left the gate open. And his grandson rode the gunwale down into the deep that never iced. Behind them on a new cedar post by the road stood a board Earl Brody had milled and lettered in his shop. The grain still pale and sharp, that read, "Hartwell's Landing, public launch and free firewood, take what you need." The woodpile lawyer had called a liability sat split and stacked dry under a tin roof beside it, free for the taking. An old enamel coffee pot on a plank for whoever wanted a cup, and there was no gate, and there would not be one. Della brushed the last of the paint along the bottom of the sign and stepped back off the road into the wet grass. The porch light came on, small and steady above the water. The lake held the last of the gold.